What's going on? Boys, thanks to our patrons and Fiverr customers, subscribe to our Patreon free for behind the scenes stuff. Arm yourselves, life stuff. We are reviewing a book today. The Truth About Mussolini and Fascism by Martin Goldberg. He's a YouTuber, you can search up his channel. Always has interesting perspective, very often ahead of the curve on things. He's written a number of books, but I started with this one. And Goldberg's intention with this book is to correct the record a bit. Mussolini and the Italian fascists were maligned by the Allies and by historians, mainly using Mussolini and fascism as auxiliary ammunition to support anti-Nazism, often painting Mussolini in particular as a buffoon, when that's not the case. If you're accustomed to the consensus narrative, you'll find Mussolini and these traditional fascists surprising, probably, in the sophistication of what they accomplished and how they accomplished it, and also in whom they were supporting. Corporatism as a system is very misunderstood. Statements and sentiments are often poorly mistranslated by English historians, not elaborated on. Mussolini and the fascists were far from saints, but they weren't stupid, and they weren't these proletariat oppressing tyrants. Shockingly so, actually. One example that stuck out to me was the way labor disputes were handled by, I think they're labor tribunals, if I'm remembering correctly, within which only 3% of the time the tribunals sided with the owners. I think it was a little over 60% of the time they sided with the workers, a little over 30% of the time they kicked the can down the road. Now, even in a system like that, 3% of the time siding with employers, I'm assuming there's a story there, but getting into all the little nitty-gritties isn't this book's intention. It's a pretty short read, and it's intended to be an English language resource about Mussolini and fascism, which there aren't many in the English language. And this book feels more like a slamming on the brakes of Mussolini as a dumb tyrant, fascists are corporate lackeys, which goes back into the misunderstanding of what a corporation, quotes, is in corporatism. It's not corporations the way we think of them. And also this conflation of Italy and fascism with Germany and Nazism. There is a much larger picture here that is being obscured. Okay, now getting into the actual review of the book. Despite the way Goldberg positions the book, this is more like a mimetic arms distribution book. And you run into these sometimes. Goldberg wants the audience to be normies, to, as I mentioned, correct the record a bit, but it's written more in the style of arming an ignorant Mussolini and fascism defense force, which is not a bad thing. But again, you need to know what you are getting into. This book is mostly for people who are aware Mussolini and fascism have been misrepresented, and in addition to learning some things, also prepare themselves for meme combat. Because you won't be walking away from this book with a complete understanding of Italian history, a concise, detailed timeline of events, extensive information about all the players. You'll be walking away with well-researched talking points. And that's why I mentioned the slamming on the brakes thing. Because while you won't be getting the full picture, you'll walk away with a bunch of barricades that will stop the consensus narrative and its momentum in its tracks. For you and ideally for others, this isn't an exhaustive history, this is a slap in the face. This is a book that shows you why the consensus narrative is incorrect, or at least incomplete, if we're being friendly, so you and others will go research more. Either to learn more about the period, because it's interesting, or for opponents people who like the consensus narrative use Mussolini and fascism in that auxiliary way, they will be forced to go back and, if not change their minds, then come up with better arguments if they don't want to step on the gas and make themselves look foolish. Not that that stops anybody ever. Now, one of my issues with this text, it seems like this is the case for most English language Mussolini fascism texts. Getting that Goldilocks zone timeline is difficult. Because with most Mussolini and fascism texts, it feels like you're expected to have that timeline already. But if you are supposed to, then I don't know where people are getting it from. Goldberg's book is like a peasant picking up a crossbow in medieval times. You'll enter a conflict more capable, but you'll lack that long discipline to operate beyond its boundaries. Which is why I mentioned it feels like you are encouraged, well, you should always be encouraged to go and research more, which is one of the nice things I like about the book. Goldberg's sources are immaculate, but the comprehensive text, it isn't, which is also fine, because when you're reading this, you need to be reading it in the context of this is a book a YouTuber wrote, probably with the understanding most people won't be reading it. It's a good brick in a wall I hope gets built. Change comes from many demoralized people across decades not giving up. But I ran into the opposite issue with M. Son of the Century. That book is loaded with details, but I have no idea what's going on. It was like this book about Napoleon that I tried to read and I accomplished nothing with, because it was a series of his letters, but there was no connective tissue between them. So you don't know what exactly is being referenced. What I mean to say here is this is not a fault of this book. This book accomplishes, I think, what it sets out to accomplish. But if you are more interested in Mussolini and fascism, don't go into this thinking this will be the Goldilocks book. In addition to the talking points you'll come away with, and I think this is the big achievement of the book, is you'll come away with an image of fascism. These are politically savvy people who took power democratically and afforded more concessions than you're led to believe they are. Mussolini is not this all-encompassing tyrant. Mussolini was voted out of power by the Grand Council of Fascism. You always forget about the king after Mussolini takes power. The king was not made irrelevant. He also wasn't this pushover. He was also very savvy. Institutions were important to these people. Mussolini, not a Christian, not a big fan of Catholicism for globalism reasons. But he built a relationship with them, going as far as reintegrating Catholicism into Italy, not just as the national religion, but also the church as an institution after some issues that happened in 1870 that I am now curious to know more about because of this national concept idea, trying to get everyone on the same page and cooperating toward the same goals so everyone can lead better lives. I didn't know the fascists instated the 40-hour work week, sick leave, and benefits. I knew about the abolishment of slavery in Ethiopia, but I didn't know how or why that happened. Mussolini was not a believer, or much of a believer, in genetic race, and certainly not the genetic superiority of races. Mussolini and the fascists were nation maxers. And you walk away from this book knowing that with some ability to back it up. Once again, you definitely don't have the full picture, but you walk away with a clearer outline. Now, there are some issues. First and simplest, there are a good number of spelling and grammatical errors. Not constant, but hard to ignore. Now, to me, that doesn't totally detract from the work when you, again, look at it in context. This is a specific work written by someone who knows they're probably not going to make any money off this, probably not even recoup the money they spent on it. When you consider the probability this was written from a deeply black-pilled place, for me, that's not a killer. However, if the intention, as was stated, to change normies' minds, the errors are things they will notice that will detract from authorial authority. And on top of that, I know this is a personal thing, but the style kills me. Did you read in 2016 any of those conservative YouTuber books? It feels a lot like those in style and in tone. Which is to say, where not wrong, grammatically inconsistent and clanky, lots of editorializing, and hard partisanship. If not in favor of conservatism or anything, extraordinarily anti-American lefty liberal. And once again in context, that's another thing I understand, but even as someone who is interested in this, and as annoyed with consensus parroting as anybody else is, that gets tiring. When it's not supported by specific arguments, even if they aren't cited, you can talk about, and he does, Goldberg does this, he talks about common leftist talking points when they talk about fascism. But even with those, how many times do you need to reiterate that liberals are annoying? I think this is a consequence of two things. One, once again, this is a passion project. And two, there is a habit with many writers keeping their hands tight on the reins, or oversaying things, or overemphasizing, fearing the reader will miss the point, or not realizing by overemphasizing they might make the reader miss a point they might otherwise get. I played Dispatch recently. That game is so bad about this. They do it mostly with their swearing, but they overemphasize using swearing, or they overexplain points, and that makes them lose two times. One, because they are devaluing the power of an emphasizer, like swearing, or like stopping, hitting the brakes to explain something to you. You can do that in your writing, and sometimes you need to. You don't want to saturate it and overdo it because then it loses all meaning. But then on top of that, when you are constantly adding emphasis, you're actually padding the punchiness of a point or a sentence that would hit so much harder on its own. So you lose twice. Goldberg does this constantly in owning the libs. It's very Vox Day-ish, which I feel bad saying that because I don't think Goldberg is in any way as fat or as bald or as retarded as Vox Day is, but I hate seeing good intentions and good research get diluted when it doesn't need to be. And this is where we get into the normie side. Again, if this is a book designed for normies, a normie will read this lib owning once and write the entire thing off. This is why I said in the beginning this book feels like an arms distribution thing for the Mussolini Defense Network. Because if you aren't coming here already wanting to have a new perspective or a positive perspective about Mussolini and fascism, you won't be persuaded or illuminated in any way. Even though you should be because of the research. If you are sincerely setting out to change the conversation about something, then you can't give anyone any ammunition, any reason to dismiss you. They're looking for reasons to dismiss you. And the other thing in that is this is very much a Mussolini fascism rah-rah book. It does not read like a clarifying text, even though it is in most cases. This book feels more like a counterpoint, which it is. This book is more like a brutal partisan ambush than it is rays of sunlight shining down and clearing away the ugly fog. Mussolini and fascists have been misrepresented. Yes. I think more people would be swayed getting to see some of Mussolini's and fascism's faults or shortcomings or failings represented correctly than they would being shown only or mostly positives represented correctly. And some of that is in there, but the reason I mention this is when you don't go into detail about these true shortcomings or failings, you're left with vulnerabilities someone better read will jump on you with. You might be able to use these positive counterpoints to bludgeon Joe Dipshit into the ground, but elite Joe Dipshit will be able to counter-ambush you. A broader, more even hand doesn't just contribute to better understanding, it contributes also to better verbal tactics. Oh, and before we conclude, other things I liked. I found I was more invested and points stuck better and longer when those human characteristics were included, more narrativized. That should be obvious, but where it was used here, it was used very well. And if you, the viewer, are considering or ever consider writing something like this, that's something to keep in mind. The more you tell a story, or the more you employ fictional styling in your nonfiction, the more people will like it and pay attention to it and remember it. Tell a story with characters. Much of the appeal of Mussolini and fascism, at least to me, is how much of a character Mussolini is. And the intrigue comes from the fact he's been misrepresented this much. Now, conclusion and then some final thoughts. Should you read this book? I think you should. Even if you aren't personally interested in Mussolini and fascism per se, with how frequently fascism as a slur gets thrown around, you'll get some clarity on what fascism is and what fascism isn't, which is important. And you'll also get some insight into the ways international power moves. How, through propaganda, through narrative, one group can become a boogeyman, a slur, while another group can become saints, regardless of the facts. And you don't need to buy and keep the book either. According to Goldberg, because the message is the most important thing here, what you can do is buy the electronic version of the book, read it in a day or two, maybe 3, and then return it. Apparently, I've never tried this. Amazon, the ebooks, you have a 7-day trial period. You can return it before 7 days, get your money back, review the book if you found it interesting, and take a look not only at Mussolini and fascism, but also, and what's more interesting to me, the meta reason, the reason I recommend you do this, is you get to see via self-publishing, the self-published cells, you get to see the way popular nonfiction can look. And we saw that back in the day, back in 2016, and I suppose we've been seeing it forever. But this book, or this author, he has a bunch of books, fascinates me because it models how you could write nonfiction, how you could throw your hat into the ring. And as with Goldberg, one author won't change the entire perception, probably won't even have or make a dent in the greater conversation, but you can have a small impact. I read this, and over enough time writing enough books, and not just coming from one author, but many sorts of books coming from many of these independent, self-publishing authors, popularly, you can begin to make a difference. It's the same reason I recommend you get into YouTube. You get into the ring. And this nonfiction shit is fascinating to me because you don't need to be doctor peer-reviewed guy to produce nonfiction, researched nonfiction. You can do this. You can compile your own research, publish your own thoughts, and have your effect. And it doesn't need to be perfect. That's one of the reasons I mentioned I love Dune so much, is just how not perfect it is, despite this overwhelming effect Dune has had on popular culture. Goldberg's book is far from perfect, but the essence is good, and he is having an impact. You can do that. You can get into the conversation and actually control the narrative, or start to. So I recommend this book both as a look into Mussolini and fascism, a brief, researched, non-consensus look, and also as a meta model for one way an organized popular force could begin to change some things. You don't need to be perfect or to be an authority or even to be right to join the changers class and start to change things the way you want them changed. Anyway, the book's on Amazon. I can't link, well, I can link it, but I'm not going to link it. Search it up on Amazon, pick it up. And don't forget to review it if you like it. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't.